Ebola could lead to civil war in West Africa. Yemen's president calls the rebel takeover a conspiracy, and India gets to Mars. Welcome to World Brief. The Ebola crisis could drive West Africa into military conflict as the international response fails to stop the spread of the disease. The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says that as many as 1.4 million people could be infected just in Liberia and Sierra Leone alone by the end of January. Liberia's information minister has warned that Ebola is threatening the very infrastructure of the country, driving it in the direction of civil war. Minister Lewis Brown told AFP, quote, "The effect of Ebola is being seen not just as a public health situation, but it's also a political situation. The world cannot wait for Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea to slip back into conflict, which could be the result of this slowness in response." In Liberia, more than 3,000 people have been infected and nearly 1,600 have died. The country, where half the population lives on less than $1 a day, dealt with 2 consecutive civil wars from 1989 to 2003. Liberia's neighbour, Sierra Leone, has seen more than 1,800 Ebola infections, and it dealt with its own 11-year-long civil war. The World Health Organization has declared the international response to the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, quote, dangerously inadequate. Last week, the United Nations Security Council voted unanimously to create an emergency medical mission, and the United States plans to build 17 Ebola treatment centres. But the centres will be staffed by local volunteers rather than American doctors, which some experts believe will slow down the response. More than 2,600 people have died in the current Ebola outbreak, more than the total number of deaths in all previously recorded outbreaks since the disease emerged in 1976. Meanwhile, in Yemen, President Hadi is warning of a full-on civil war. Over the weekend, he signed a UN-brokered ceasefire with Houthi Shia rebels who seized control of the parliament, army headquarters and central bank. But now any hopes for a unity government seem slim after President Hadi called the rebel takeover of Sana'a a conspiracy that'll lead to civil war. Joining us to discuss the latest developments in Yemen is Al-Hamdani, a Yemeni analyst and researcher. Thanks so much for being with us. Can you just start by backing us up here and just explaining to people who may not have been paying terribly much attention who the Houthis are and what precipitated this latest crisis?
Absolutely. The Houthis are a rebel movement that existed in Sada. They're composed of a Zaydi group, that's a Zaydi Shia group, but Zaydism is actually practiced very similarly to Shafi'i Sunni sects. So in Yemen, they were able to coexist for many years. And Zaydism has existed in Yemen for as long as Zaydism has been created. So the movement actually started as a rebel movement, I would say, as early as 1994. The government engaged in war with the Houthi group in 2001, and they engaged in 6 wars. And after that, after the revolution, they were welcomed into the capital, into the national dialogue to be one of the members who are negotiating Yemen's future. And after the end of the dialogue in 2014, everybody saw the Houthis as no longer a rebel group, but as a political party that is called Ansar Allah. What's surprising is that the Houthis or Ansar Allah were not happy with the status quo. They wanted to have more share in the government. And so they found that their demands were not met. So they decided to go ahead with this approach.
Was it a surprise?
It would be a surprise to those who thought that the national dialogue was successful, to those who believed that Yemen was actually stable and peaceful. But on the ground, it was always shaky. It was unstable, and there were a lot of assassinations taking place. What was surprising was not that the Houthis wanted to do this. What was surprising was the government's role in all of this, how they were almost surrendering to the Houthis. The takeover was very quick, and the military was not responsive. They almost watched the Houthis, and they kind of watched them take over the city.
Yeah, what's the explanation for that, for the military not taking on the Houthis?
Well, the military right after 2011 was restructured. The military was actually loyal to the former president Ali Abdullah Saleh, and after he left, they wanted to restructure it. And rather than the military being loyal to the people or to the country, people in the military had allegiances to specific leaders. And so with the restructuring, the military was weaker than ever because all these soldiers did not obey the government, but rather the leader in their division. And so when the Houthis came to Sana'a, they were fighting the military divisions that belonged to Ali Muhsin, who used to be Ali Abdullah Saleh's right-hand man, and then in this current government was the military advisor to President Hadi. And so when the military would engage with the Houthis, it seemed that only Ali Muhsin's military or some other groups of militaries would fight with him, but the majority of the military seemed to step down, and they allowed for the Houthis to do this.
So you've effectively got a de facto coup, in a sense, where the military is splitting off and supporting the Houthis.
Well, the military, though, was not active. They were kind of just like watching this take place.
Yeah. Right,
So,
but an act of omission can be the same as an act of commission, depending on what the outcome is. So where do we go from here? We've got Sunday's ceasefire agreement. What does it mean for President Hadi to now be speaking out and calling the Houthi takeover a conspiracy?
Well, it's kind of surprising that he came out and called it a conspiracy after he signed a deal with them. I would assume that he would have called it a conspiracy before he agreed to a specific set of rules to carry on the future month. So what happened is 48 hours ago, they signed a deal. They agreed that Yemen is going to have a new prime minister. This is a huge issue of debate because it's going to be very hard to find someone that the Houthis want, who Hadi also accepts, who the Islah party is also going to endorse. So they're actually going to have to hire someone for the first time who's a technocrat, someone who's entirely independent. Once the prime minister is selected, they're going to have to form a new government. So everything is going to rest on this prime minister guy, but the Houthis refused to sign a specific clause in the treaty. They refused to withdraw from the capital, Sana'a. They want to stay in Sana'a. There are now popular committees all over the capital that are run and controlled by the Houthis. And so it seems that the Houthis are still undecided about what they want. They themselves don't know whether they want to take over or do they want a share in the government, and they'll be happy with that. It's very clear from the Houthi speech yesterday in the morning that he declared AQAP as his enemy. That's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And he has specific opponents in the Islah party that he's not happy with. And so it seems that he wants to prove his strength. I hope that he is willing to accept a share of the government and then retract back to Sada, because if he decides that he wants to take over, I don't think that this group is capable of taking control of the entire country, and it's going to be a disaster, and the country is definitely going to break apart.
What's the sense, is there a way of generalizing about the general sentiment from Sunni Yemenis towards the Houthis? The Houthis are Shia. There's always suspicion in Sunni countries in the Middle East that that Shia are agents of Iran.
Yeah, so Yemen is actually unique because the Sunni sect in Yemen is Shafi'i, and the Shia sect in Yemen is Zaydi, and the Zaydi and Shafi'i sect are actually very similar. The Twelver Shia in Iran used to distance themselves from Zaydism because it was too similar to Sunnis, right? So traditionally, these two sects were very similar and they coexisted. The problem began when the Sunni sect in Yemen started to transform into Wahhabism. And that happened around the time that the US had the war in Afghanistan, when we were sending jihadis from Yemen to fight the war there. That's when Sunniism started shifting and becoming into Wahhabism, or we started also importing Muslim Brotherhood movements. And I think Zaydism then had a reaction to that, in that it became more radicalized and more militant. And now the Houthi movement is not entirely Zaydi. It doesn't practice Zaydism the way that the ancestors did. It seems to kind of morphed a little bit. Obviously, Iran has a lot of interest in the region, and Yemen is probably a place where they can advance. But it seems that Saudi Arabia is not that concerned at the moment because they're worrying about the war with ISIS, and they have stopped their support to the Muslim Brotherhood since they engaged in war in Syria. So I'm not worried that this is an Iranian influence in the country. It's actually kind of a grassroots movement that's slightly transformed. But I would just say that international influence is not that important. What's important is to stabilize everything and kind of see how it's going to proceed forward.
Speaking of international influence, I saw this tweet from Gregory D. Johnson of BuzzFeed yesterday on Tuesday, saying the big story in Yemen must seem to be missing is that the Houthis just overthrew a 3+ year transition effort backed by the US and international community. What is the US likely to do here? We're already so tied up, as you say, focused on ISIS, but we backed the 2011 deal that replaced Saleh with Hadi. So what's the next chess move?
Yeah, so the U.S. supported the national dialogue that took place from March 2013 to January 2014. And this dialogue was declared a success by the international community, and everybody blessed it, and they were considering it as a model for Libya and Syria and other countries. Obviously, people on the ground in Yemen were very skeptical, and other writers and young activists that I know have always warned that this process is not going to be successful. The U.S. is most probably going to support and endorse the Houthis because they declare Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as their main enemy. And the U.S. is a very realistic country. I think they want to see who's powerful in the country and then support that group.
Thanks, Summer. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
German-American journalist Michael Scott Moore is free after nearly 3 years in captivity in Somalia. Moore was taken by an armed militia while reporting on piracy for a book he was writing. His release comes after careful negotiation from German and US officials. The AP reported that ransom was paid, but the amount remains unknown, along with the identity of his captors. Somalia has long been racked by war, with armed groups fighting for control since 1991, when President Siad Barre was overthrown. Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked organisation, runs rife across the country, though it's not thought to be involved with Moore's kidnapping. On his release, the 45-year-old journalist was flown to Mogadishu for a medical and psychological examination. According to Spiegel Online, the German publication where Moore was freelancing at the time of his disappearance, he appeared to be in good health. Spiegel's editor-in-chief, Wolfgang Buchner, said, quote, "We never gave up hope and are now rejoicing with Michael and his family that this nightmare has finally come to an end." Now to 3 Afghan soldiers who disappeared from Joint Base Cape Cod in Massachusetts last Saturday. The soldiers were found earlier this week trying to cross the Canadian border in Buffalo, New York. They may not have enjoyed military training, but they sure enjoy a good old-fashioned strip club. Yep. Before they took off, the trio stopped at Zachary's Pub, an all-nude exotic entertainment establishment fully equipped with pool tables, $4 draft beer, lobster, and naked women. It's a local hangout for the nearby military base. The Afghan deserters are being held in the Buffalo Federal Detention Facility and are being charged with administrative immigration violations. India has made it to Mars. Yesterday, Tuesday, the country's unmanned robotic craft, Mangalyaan, arrived at the Red Planet. It'll be in orbit for at least 6 months. This makes India the 4th nation in the world to pull off a Mars mission after the US, Russia, and European Union. Liftoff brought cheering and excitement inside the space agency's Mission Tracking Centre in Bangalore as Prime Minister Narendra Modi looked on.
Today has been created today. We have dared to reach out into the unknown and have achieved the near impossible.
The best part of this mission is, like everything in India, it's a bargain. While NASA's current Mars mission is costing us $670 million, India's is costing them a trifling $74 million. Prime Minister Modi was quick to point out that that is less than what it cost to make the movie Gravity. NASA's Curiosity rover tweeted its congratulations to India. Namaste, Mars Orbiter. Congratulations to India's Mars Orbiter and India's first interplanetary mission upon achieving Mars orbit. India's Mangalyaan promptly responded to NASA, saying, "Howdy, Mars Curiosity. Keep in touch. I'll be around." Now to Indonesia, where polygamous marriages are legal under civil and customary law. A new documentary, Bitter Honey, follows the lives of 3 polygamous families in Bali. It was shot over a multi-year period and delves into the personal stories of the wives in each family. Take a look.
Sampai di sini tidak tahu ada orang. Akhirnya dia udah ada di sini.
Dan lagi kelahiran anak kedua saya baru 11 hari dicarikan madu lagi, gimana nggak sakit gitu.
Itu di undang-undang itu sendiri sudah sangat tidak adil, sudah sangat membedakan posisi perempuan itu sendiri.
Sekali nikah seumur hidup bisa mati di sini.
Joining us now is the film's director, Robert Lemelson. Thanks for being here, Robert.
Sure.
Great to talk to you. Just for people who aren't familiar with Bali, just explain what the island is like and how different it is from the rest of Indonesia.
Well, Bali is an island of 3 million Hindus and a sea of about 250 million Muslims. It's been marketed both by the Balinese and the international community as a tourist paradise. Our film and my work, I've worked there for 20 years as an anthropologist, goes a little bit behind the screen to show what life is really like for the average Balinese.
Yeah, and so tell us what life is like for the average Balinese, because as you say, there's this sort of portion of the, I guess, the southeast of Bali, which is very touristy with lots of resorts and lots of Aussies and Brits.
Right.
And then there's the whole rest of the country.
Yeah. Well, the film itself deals with 3 families, who one has 2 wives, one has 5 wives, one has 10 wives. Polygamy is relatively uncommon in Bali, maybe 10%, but the dynamics in the family, I think, reflect larger dynamics in Bali proper. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gender-based violence in the family. There's a lot of infidelity. And unfortunately, with the kind of rise of globalization and the massive amount of money, there's a huge increase in both sex trafficking and sex tourism. And some of that is now filtered out to the local population. So there's a lot of brothels throughout the island that are frequented by Balinese men. And so when men go to these brothels and we're 25% of the sex workers are HIV positive, and they return to a family with 2 or 5 wives, are just not infecting one wife, but potentially many.
Does Indonesian law make it difficult for women in polygamous relationships to leave, to have rights?
I wouldn't say it's the law. It's actually, this is an example where culture kind of works against women's rights. In some ways, Balinese culture, because Bali is both patrilocal and patrilineal, meaning that women move into the male compound when they get married, and then they live with a multi-generational male family with grandfathers and their brothers, fathers and their brothers, and male children and their wives. And when a woman wants to leave, her children stay with the husband. Here in the West, and generally, there's joint custody, or the children will stay with the mother, and there the children stay with the father. So they lose their kids. Then also, because descent goes through the male lineage, they lose inheritance rights. So they lose property rights. So they lose their property. And then, this is where it gets a little more complicated. Balinese have a belief in this cyclical recycling of souls within a family lineage. So for example, my soul, if I was Balinese, would be my great-grandfather's soul. And when I die, it would go into my great-great-grandson, multi-generations hence. And when Balinese women divorce, they get cut off from that lineage, so they lose their soul. So they lose their children, they lose their property, they lose their soul, and then finally, unmarried women have a very, very low status in a village, so they lose their social positioning. So it's that contributes to the fact that Balinese divorce rates are about 5%, right, compared to Java, the island next to it, 60%.
Yeah, right. Very culturally different place,
yeah,
and different religion as well. You look, of course, at the health consequences of this on Balinese women. Just take a look at a clip from the film.
Kami yakinkan kemungkinan yang selalu ya kene terus gitu yang lah pikiran dengan pasti ya Pak kalau bisa kene gitu.
Lebih nyesal ya, mau gimana lagi ya, udah terlanjur seperti ini.
As you mentioned, you're an anthropologist, not just a filmmaker. What most struck you about the cultural consequences of what's going on there as an anthropologist?
Yeah, I've been working for almost 2 decades there. So I've looked at a lot of different, both in terms of research and film. We've done projects on mental illness, on genocide, on sex trafficking, on ritual life, a whole range. I mean, Balinese culture is one of the most, in some ways, integrated societies in the world. People are connected to each other in ways we can't possibly imagine. So if you're in a village, you're connected by kinship to people in the village, by caste, because it's a Hindu society, by work groups, by other forms of both governmental and local relations. So everyone is connected in a very dense social network, which makes it difficult if you're either different in some way, or if you want to escape from that because conditions are really oppressive. For example, in most of the families, as I mentioned, there's both violence and infidelity, and women can't escape from that.
If people want to be involved, if they want to change something like this, what do you recommend that they do? Should we not go to Bali as tourists? Should we go to Bali as tourists?
Oh, no, you should definitely. I mean, Bali remains a wonderful place for tourists. It's really one of the premier destinations to see culture in some ways. What we're doing, we're using the film in an advocacy sense. So we're helping set up the first gender-based violence program in Bali. There's a program that started after the fall of the Suharto regime in '98 that addresses gender-based violence in Jakarta, and we're working with programs there and the National Commission on Women in Jakarta to set up a gender-based violence program in Bali so women will have an option outside of the village social structure to go if they're in abusive relationships.
Great. Good on you, Robert. Thanks for coming by. Be sure to look out for the film. It debuts in theatres across the country during late October and November. Well, the 2014 Asian Games are underway in South Korea. 45 countries are participating in the two-week event across 36 sports, including the standard fare like swimming, gymnastics and rowing, as well as also more Asian events like judo, wushu and something called sepak takraw, a type of kick volleyball. But the Games have just had their first hiccup. The Qatari women's basketball team had to forfeit after being asked by the International Basketball Federation to remove their headscarves before play. Qatar's chief de mission for the Games claims, "We were expecting our players to play with the hijab. That's why we came here. Nobody told us that it will not be allowed and we're still waiting for clarifications." But a prominent Qatari women's sports activist says, "We knew about the hijab ban, but we have to be here. We have to show everyone that we are ready to play, but the International Association is not ready." The International Basketball Federation allows women to wear sweatbands, but not hijabs. The organisation has been meeting to revisit the headgear rules, but for now, immediate changes are a no-go. A photographer in the Ivory Coast's Abidjan has captured a dying West African tradition on her camera in her latest project. Scarification is a disappearing tradition across Africa. In her portrait series titled Abre, The Last Generation, Joanna Chamali explores traditional face scarification in Africans from Burkina Faso. Joining me now to discuss the series is the photographer, Joanna Chamali. Joanna, thank you so much for being with us. What inspired you to take on this project?
When I was a child, it was very common to find people with scarification in the streets. We wouldn't even think about it. It was really something part of our culture. And with the passing years, I realized that it was disappearing. So I wanted to understand what it felt like to live in the city in Abidjan and to live with these scarifications on the face, how it felt, how somebody could live his life without being fitting in anymore.
And what's the purpose of scarification in these cultures? And is it legal?
Yeah, the first purpose of scarification in Burkina Faso, in the Core tribe, is identification. One of my subjects told me that it was to recognize each other, and that now that the scarification is disappearing, we cannot recognize each other anymore. So the first one is really to recognize each other.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Yes and no. I cannot really judge, but what I can feel is that it's practice that was useful when people couldn't write or be educated, and nowadays it's difficult for them to know exactly what feeling they have about it.
Mm. At what age are people scarred?
Oh, they are scared at a very young age, the first years of childhood. Mm. Yeah.
Is it still perceived as a positive thing culturally, or is it becoming more taboo?
Yes and no. It's becoming more taboo in the city because people are not used anymore to see these tribal marks because it's so traditional. But for the people I could interview, there is a contradiction in the way that they feel it, because when they were young, when they were living in the village, it was something valued, something considered as beautiful. For example, for Mrs. Geneva, one of my subjects, she used to brag about it. She was so proud of it. And now when she came to Abidjan, she came to the big city, people started calling her torn face, and it was really difficult for her. Now she hates it.
Is this a tradition that you think can continue, or will this, in a generation's time, will this perhaps have gone away?
Oh, I think it won't continue, because most of the people I met decided not to do it on their children's face, and as it's not really allowed now in Burkina Faso, it's prohibited by the government. It's definitely going to disappear. Yes.
Was it traditionally done in a kind of a ceremony, or was it done at home? Is it a rite of passage for kids?
Yes, for the Koro tribe, it was done at home. Sometimes, especially by women who had a style. They were famous about it for that, and it was done at home. Mostly at home. Parents would call the woman, and she would come and do it for a little money, or in exchange of fall or karité butter.
You photographed your subjects from the back as well as from the front. Why did you choose to do that?
I chose that to symbolize the fact that there would be anonymous if they could be without scarification. But when they are in the front, they cannot hide anymore. They cannot pretend to be somebody else. They just have to face it, and they have to admit whether they like it or not.
Joanna, thank you so much for being with us. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Ask a dead artist what he wants for his deathiversary, and maybe he'll say, "Write me a musical." Well, lucky you, Vincent van Gogh. To mark 125 years since his death, the Van Gogh Europe Foundation is partnering with a Dutch theatre producer to put the life and masterpieces of the legendary painter on stage, set to music. Titled simply Vincent, the show will open early next year. One of the 19th century's most influential visionaries, the Dutchman had a turbulent personal life, famously cutting off his ear, of course. He was shot to death at age 37, rumoured to be self-inflicted. Amsterdam's Van Gogh Museum is planning its own exhibit to couple with the show. Says museum director Axel Rueger, it's perhaps a little odd to celebrate his death, but over the years the artist has become a global celebrity, a kind of rock star. We can't wait to see Vincent's time stamp. That's all for World Brief today. You can join the conversation by leaving a comment in our comment well or tweeting the stories you're following to me at Josh Sepps. You can also join me right here in the Google Hangout by clicking the red Be an On-Air Guest button. Stay tuned, much more coming up right here on HuffPost Live.